and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. Today we're going to talk about Margaret Tudor.
One day we will be remembered.
We've talked about Margaret before, guys, in the Elizabeth of York episode. Elizabeth of York was the mother of King Henry VIII, and she was also the mother of Margaret Tudor. This week we're talking about King Henry VIII's sister. Margaret Tudor was born on the 28th of November, 1489, 500 years before Taylor Swift. She had an older brother, Arthur, who was 3 years older than her, and her parents seemed to be getting along because just a year and a half after her birth, they added her brother and spare heir, Prince Henry, the future King Henry VIII. But for now, he was just a dumb little brother who was cute and charming and kind of a fun kid, allegedly. And just 13 months later, Princess Elizabeth joined the royal nursery. Their mother visited them at the royal nursery often and seemed to really enjoy time with her children. She was a very engaged mother, especially for that time. Their father, though reportedly quite a frugal man, was also totally a Christmas guy. He went all out for Christmas. Christmas was his moment. When Margaret was 5 and a half, her little sister Elizabeth died, 6 days before their older brother Arthur turned 9. So that would have added sadness at the royal nursery for sure. They were missing someone. Queen Elizabeth, though, was expecting again, and just 6 months after the death of little Elizabeth, the royal couple had Princess Mary. And spoiler alert, Princess Mary was the future Queen of France. So the siblings, Margaret, Henry, and Mary, would become the Queen of Scots, the King of England, and the Queen of France, respectively. They were kind of the power siblings of their time. 3 years after Mary came, Prince Edmund arrived in 1499. The following year, in 1500, the royal children were sent to a more remote palace because the plague was running wild. Prince Arthur was 13 at this point and likely housed away from his siblings as the future king. He had different kind of training. Princess Margaret was 10. Prince Henry was with his sisters. He was just 9. Mary was 4 and baby Edmund was 1. The king and queen went to Calais for 40 days. They're like, we'll just have our French vacation. Everyone will stay safe from the plague. Let's get out of London. When the king and queen were returning to their children, however, after their 40-day Francecation, they got news that baby Edmund had died. Maybe of the plague, maybe something else. But the other children were still living. Prince Edmund died at the age of 16 months, 9 days before Prince Harry turned 9. Similarly to the way his other brother was about to turn 9 when their other sibling had died. The next year, Margaret's older brother Arthur was married at the age of 15 to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess. Margaret was about 11 when all the wedding celebrations were going on. But just a few months later, Prince Arthur got sick and died, still only 15 years old. When Arthur died, Margaret would have been about 12. Her preteen years weren't so happy. A year after Arthur passed, Margaret's mother was pregnant again. Unfortunately, she died trying to have that baby, and Princess Catherine also died that same week, the baby who was born. Margaret was due to leave for Scotland. She was betrothed to the Scottish king, who, if you learned in the last episode, became king young when he deposed his father. She had enjoyed running around the castle, pointing out that she now outranked her brother Harry, because she, as a princess, would not have outranked her brother, a prince, the spare. But once she was betrothed to the King of Scotland, she was the future Queen of Scotland, meaning she would outrank her brother then. And that move did not go over well with little Harry. Margaret loved it, though. She was like, bow to your queen, peasant. And he was like, ugh, sisters. So Margaret was due to leave for Scotland, but this was delayed because of the death of her mother. Not delayed much, though, because just 3 months after the death of her mother, Margaret left for Scotland. It took her over a month to make this journey, but she didn't have to sail, so that's a plus. Her father accompanied her to the Scottish border, at which point, you're on your own, kid. They were married in person a week after her arrival, on the 8th of August, 1503. Princess Margaret married King James IV of Scotland. She was just 13. He was 30. Yikes. This marriage was very much a political alliance. It was depicted as the marriage of the thistle and the rose. The thistle being the national flower of Scotland, and the rose because Margaret was from the union that united the roses from the Wars of the Roses. In part because of this, and probably the bride's standing as a princess of England, she didn't have her first baby until she was 17, so thankful for that. Her husband already had at least 5 illegitimate children, maybe as many as 9, with at least 4 different women. He was already a baby daddy for sure. And a lot of his kids lived at Stirling Castle, which was technically at this point Margaret's castle, so that made things a little bit awkward. Like, oh, by the way, my kids are living at your castle. Their moms are just, wherever. There's a bunch of them. They're just off places. During this time, the king was off on siege sometimes, and the queen was still growing up, because she's a middle schooler, remember? She seems to have tried to model her blossoming queenship on that of her mother, Elizabeth of York, who has her own episode. Check it out. Elizabeth of York was exactly what an English queen should be. Often, her husband, King Henry, had to lean on her for court or state etiquette. When they met with foreign dignitaries, Elizabeth was usually the one best suited for giving the royal impression. She was born a princess, and that is what Margaret wanted to be. Born a princess, turned into a queen. And her mother was very popular with the people, so Margaret wanted to emulate that. When Margaret was 15, she had one of those chances to become a beloved queen of the people. She was celebrating Maundy Thursday. I grew up celebrating Maundy Thursday, but I have learned through trial and error that most people I encounter don't know what that is. So, if you're wondering, Maundy Thursday or Holy Thursday is the day before Good Friday, the Thursday before Easter, and it's remembering the Last Supper of Jesus. As a kid, we'd have a church service and a sermon, usually about the Last Supper, and then a potluck dinner with soup and bread, because the Last Supper. But that wasn't what Margaret had planned. As Queen of Scotland, the tradition was for Margaret and James to give gifts to the poor, and symbolically wash their feet. Margaret decided she would give to 15 poor women blue gowns, shoes, and a purse with 15 English pennies in it, and a wooden tankard with a plate and a cup to symbolize the Last Supper. 15 poor women and 15 pennies, because Margaret was a 15-year-old queen. Margaret liked Scotland enough, but she did suffer from ill health in Scotland. She oftentimes had fairly severe nosebleeds. By late spring of 1506, 16-year-old Margaret was pregnant with her first child. She was 16 and pregnant. She had the baby the following winter, in early 1507, having just turned 17. Her baby was named Prince James, after his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, and his great-great-grandfather. They were always going to name this baby James. Around this time, King James IV acquired a printing press. He really was a Renaissance man. He was really leaning into this Renaissance thing. He wasn't into the war. He liked books and poetry and songs, and he was more of a thinker. And this is generally seen as sort of the start of the Renaissance in Scotland. Margaret had her baby in February. 5 months later, she was said to have gone on pilgrimage after a period of ill health. This could have been after recovering from pregnancy, but it sounds like she didn't have the easiest 5 months postpartum. So she had a baby, and then 5 months of sickness. She went to a church to thank God, and just 7 months later, Margaret's baby James died, 1 week after his first birthday. Margaret was about 4 months pregnant with her second baby when her first baby died. That summer, in July, Margaret had her next baby, a princess who died shortly after she was born. Margaret, only 18, now had given birth to and then lost 2 babies. By early the next year, Margaret was pregnant for the 3rd time, and I'm sure that was nothing if not scary. In April, Margaret's father died, and this would have been hard. She had been writing him letters about how homesick she was, but her father had tuberculosis, and he was gone in the spring. This meant that Margaret's younger brother, Prince Harry, was now King Henry VIII, and he was wasting no time. He had a wedding to Catherine of Aragon, and then a coronation in just 2 months. And just after all the celebrations in England, Margaret's grandmother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, also died. Margaret had suffered a lot of loss. She was 5 months pregnant when her brother became king and her grandmother died. She had her third baby in October of that year named Prince Arthur, probably after her late brother, Prince Arthur. Just a couple of months after Arthur was born, her sister, Queen Catherine, remember Catherine of Aragon? She had her first baby, but it was stillborn. Margaret's Prince Arthur, the new baby, only lived to be 9 months old, however. Margaret probably wasn't in a great place mentally. She had a lot of loss over the last decade, and it didn't seem to be slowing down. Word probably came from England that her brother, King Henry, and Queen Catherine had a baby boy that winter, but he too died after about a month. Margaret was pregnant again, a year after she lost her third baby, and in the spring of 1512, she had her fourth baby, Prince James, in April, just like his late older brother. After all, her husband had a brother named James. There wasn't a lot of downtime between babies. Just 7 months after Prince James was born, Queen Margaret was in labor again. But even if she had gotten pregnant right away, this was too premature for a baby to be born at that time. The baby had the appearance of a girl, but died just after being born. It was too premature. Word would have made its way from England that Catherine and Henry had a new baby boy, but he too died just after birth. Things were not going well for the Tudors around this time. Margaret's brother was off fighting in France, and Margaret's husband decided it was time to invade England. Margaret wasn't in favor of her husband invading her brother, but Margaret's husband wasn't asking for her permission. King James IV, Margaret's husband, died fighting England, with Queen Catherine leading the army, because her husband was fighting in France, and Catherine sent James's bloody coat to her husband in France as a sort of trophy. Queen Margaret was about 2 months pregnant for the 6th time when her husband was killed. Dowager Queen Margaret was made regent for her baby, King James V. Remember the Stuart curse? We have another baby king. So far, the oldest king became king at 15, and the rest of them were young children. So Queen Margaret was made regent for her baby king. The pro-French faction, though, didn't want her to be regent. She was, after all, English, and the sister of the enemy country's king. Her sister-in-law had presided over her husband's death. But nevertheless, she was made regent as her husband had indicated that he wanted. And then she had her baby, Prince Alexander, who was born in April 1514. She didn't waste any time. She needed allies. She remarried just 4 months after the birth of Prince Alexander. She married in secret to Archibald Douglas because, if we've learned anything this season, the Douglases were a powerful family. But this was the final straw, and civil war broke out between Margaret's faction and the pro-French faction. By remarrying, according to the terms of her husband's will, she had to resign the regency, and she lost custody of her children in the process. I have to assume she didn't know that was part of the deal, because I can't imagine she was like, forget it, I'm just so excited to get married that I'm just going to lose everything else. In May 1515, Margaret's late husband's cousin, Albany, showed up in Scotland. He had been living in France. So the pro-French faction chose Albany to head up their side. By August, she was under siege at Stirling Castle by the French supporters. Albany had been made the new regent, and he wanted the royal children. Her husband was like, I'm outie, and I want to just go hang out at this other castle over here. Like, tell me when it's over. Margaret's brother, King Henry VIII, had been urging her to flee with her children to England, but she had refused, worrying that leaving might hurt her son's chances at staying the King of Scots. And now it was too late to flee with her children. The regent was outside her walls, with an army, demanding her sons. She did end up handing her sons over, but she was also pregnant again, with her second husband's baby. She secretly agreed to take her brother up on his offer. During this time, her sister Mary became the Queen of France at the age of 18. She married the 53-year-old King of France, who died just 3 months later. And Mary returned to England and eloped with Charles Brandon, but we'll get into that if we talk about the Queens of France. Back in Scotland, Margaret was being watched, and that made it difficult for her to escape to England. She had to ask for permission to travel. She requested permission to spend her pregnancy in a castle, and then when she got permission, she escaped to a different castle, and then to a priory, and then across the border to England, all while quite pregnant. Margaret was still in northern England when she had her baby. Her baby, Lady Margaret Douglas, was born in northern England just after she crossed the border. When little Lady Margaret was just 2 months old, Margaret got word that her youngest son, Prince Alexander, had died. at just a year and a half. There was definitely a faction that was talking about how the new regent had maybe gone the Richard III direction, allegedly, and killed Little Prince. But Margaret didn't think so. She said it didn't make sense. Why would they kill the spare and not the little king? If that's what they were doing, they would have killed the king. They both would have died. And King James V was the still living 3-year-old king. Margaret also started thinking that her marriage was struggling. Remember when her husband was like, I'm outie? He stayed outie, and she was in England by herself. She had just had Archibald's baby in northern England, and Archibald was back in Scotland making nice with the regent that had her last surviving son. Her brother and sister-in-law had their first surviving baby just 11 months after Lady Margaret was born. She had a cousin, the future Queen Mary I. After about a year in England, Margaret's brother had come to an agreement with the regent of Scotland, and she was going to return to Scotland. That was part of the deal. The Queen Mother will come back. We're going to look all nicey-nicey, unity, but as part of the deal, you can't just kill her when she comes back. The regent was away in France, arranging the little King James' future marriage, and he wanted to stay there. He was like, you know what? Why don't you just do that regent thing again? I like it in France. And Margaret came back to her husband, but it didn't last long because she found out that while she had spent a year in England having and raising his baby at Scotland Yard, he had been living with a former lover. And then she found out that she had been funding the bill the entire time. They'd been living off of her money, her husband and his girlfriend. Margaret wrote her brother, King Henry, hinting that divorce may be her only option. Like, look, it's bad. It's bad and I may have no other choice. I might have to get a divorce. And Henry, King Henry VIII, who was at this time still very Catholic, opposed divorce for all reason. And that's ironic if you know anything about King Henry VIII. I'm sure he was also against beheading people. But Margaret had just allied with her husband as an ally against the pro-France faction of the regent, but she didn't like her husband much, and she had already lost the regency and custody of her son. And the regent didn't seem to find her a threat anymore. He was just like, yeah, just do your thing. I want to stay in France. So she decided to switch sides over to the pro-France faction that had started because they didn't want an English woman as their regent. She flat joined the other side. The regent was still in France and he was being pressured to return. People were like, look, it's getting a little weird here. Things are going down. I don't know. I think we need someone to be the boss. And he was like, I don't want to. I like France. He told Margaret, I'm good. I'm going to stay in France. Take care of it for me. Just, talk in my name and fill me in when something important happens. For the next 3 years, it was the Battle of the Douglases. Dowager Queen Margaret was a woman scorned. And that is when the regent decided to show back up again from France after she had been fighting with her husband for 3 years. With the support of the Dowager Queen, he started getting things in Scotland under control. She was like, yeah, I could use the help. I'm trying to mess with my husband. Please take over this country thing for me. They were working together. The Queen greeted the regent with such enthusiasm that rumors were soon all over that their relationship had turned romantic. And it hadn't. They were just both like, yeah, we're a good team. Not a romantic team. It wasn't. Margaret started building her own faction again against the regent, so they're working together, but also not. And in 1524, the regent was removed, and he went back to France, but that's his happy place anyway. Margaret had control of her 12-year-old son. Again, he's 12 by this point, because it's been a while. The Regency Council was ended, and Margaret was made chief counselor to the king. She was like, I'm your mother, just listen to me. We got this. And he was like, yeah, okay, fine, I'm 12. Let's do it. Margaret wasn't making any friends, though. The situation was delicate. She did have one new friend. Margaret, now 35, had made friends with the 29-year-old Henry Stuart, and she elevated Henry's station. He was her favorite. Her husband showed back up in Scotland, trying to get back his spot on the council, and his wife was like, no, get out of here. Do not come in this castle. You don't get to be on my council. And Margaret had cannons shot at him. 2 English ambassadors that were at Scottish court said maybe she shouldn't shoot cannons at her husband. She's like, just a thought. And she was all, go home and mind your own business. I don't need to learn how to be a queen from you. Shoot him again. So the following year, Margaret's husband was admitted to the council. They talked her into putting her cannons down, and he used his power to control the young king, which is probably what she was worried about in the first place. The king was just used as a pawn by his stepfather and his English uncle, King Henry VIII. Margaret became almost obsessive about getting her marriage annulled. She was willing to use any argument, even that maybe her first husband hadn't been killed by the English. Maybe he was still alive when she got married. Who knows? You don't know. I don't know. We don't know. I mean, we do know. He wasn't. But she was like, maybe he's alive. Prove it. Prove he's dead. Because if he's not dead, I'm still married to him, and I'm not married to this loser. In March 1527, the Pope granted her the annulment that she so desperately wanted. But just 2 months later, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, sacked Rome. So she wasn't notified. At this point, Margaret's brother, King Henry, was no longer completely against divorce, and he was seeking his own annulment from Queen Catherine. But Queen Catherine's nephew had just sacked Rome. So Margaret didn't find out her marriage had been annulled until 9 months after it had happened. Because when Rome gets sacked, mail gets lost. Margaret found out that she'd been divorced for 9 months, so yay, and started planning her next marriage. Just 3 months after she learned out about her divorce, she was married to her favorite, Henry Stuart. In 1533, Margaret's sister Mary died in England. Again, we'll get back to that with the Queens of France. Margaret pushed her son, King James V, to meet with her brother, King Henry VIII. But King James didn't trust England, and there were too many dissenting voices, so nothing materialized. He was like, you know what, no, I may be a teenager, but I don't want to go see my uncle. I don't like him. I don't trust him. And then the 18th of October, 1541, Dowager Queen Margaret died. It is thought that she had a stroke. She didn't die right away. Word was sent to her son, King James, but he didn't arrive in time, and she was gone by the time he got there. What did you think of Margaret Tudor, King Henry VIII's sister? I think she really loved her husband, and I think he loved her. He was a lot older than her, and don't love that age difference at that age, but they do seem to have had a lot in common. They seem to have become in love once she was a grown-up, and I think they were in love. Unfortunately, her husband attacked her sister-in-law, and that ended with his early death. And she had a lot of pregnancies, but only ended up with 2 children that survived till her death, because all her other children died so young. She had a lot of loss. Her brother, her mother, her father, her grandmother, a lot of her kids. But she seemed to stay strong through it, and she seems to have been the English queen she wanted to be in Scotland. She seems to have emulated her mother fairly well given the circumstances. If you're looking for book recommendations, one of the books I used for research during this season of the podcast was Scottish History for Dummies by William Knox. It's good. It's basic. It should be called like Scottish History for Beginners or Intro to Scottish History. But it does break it down in a pretty basic way so you get the general idea of how things go. And I enjoyed reading it, even if it is Scottish History for Dummies. I feel like it made me a little smarter. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at longlivethequeenpodcast. Long live to all the queens out there. And until next week, bye.
Will be remembered.
Thanks for listening.